So Disney just released a live-action version of Moana. I don't know if you're Moana fans, and it's out in theaters right now. And over the history of Disney, they've actually had over 800 movies, which is kind of crazy to think about. They've had a lot of movies that had music in it. They had some great songs, right? I was a teenager in the time of, I think I started watching Disney movies at The Little Mermaid, and by the time I was a little bit older, I kind of stopped. I think the last one was The Lion King. So it was The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, Lion King, or Lion King Aladdin, one of those, right? And so those handful of movies and the soundtracks from them are like the things I grew up on. All right, and I don't know if the younger generation, if you have a different set, like those are your movies, because I know some younger people, they really hyped up. What's the Emperor's New Groove, right? And I was a little old for that, so I was like, no, it's so good, right? And I don't know what are the ones today. Of course, they're just remaking all of them in live action. So maybe the ones I like, the ones you like, you just like the live action ones more. But my favorite Disney song is actually not from that era. It's actually from Moana. Not the live action one, but the original one. It is We Know the Way, right? And that is actually my favorite. And I realized that over time because my kids would, listen to different songs and whatever, right, on the little Alexa box thingy we have, and other songs, if it's on repeat, when you get to about like the 100th time, it starts to really bother you, right? Music is like that. But the Moana music, it never bothered me, right? And that's how I was like, I think I really like Moana music, right? And We Know the Ways, I really think is like actually my favorite Disney song out of all the movies. And I think it's about Moana's ancestors. Like, it's kind of like a flashback song, and how they explore the new islands, right? And they say that we know the way because they know how to get there, and that we also know the way home, okay? And I think I really like it, not just because of the music, but I think it's because there's a theme of hope in that song. Right, the ancestors sing, we know the way, we know how to get there, how to get back. And then I thought, wait a minute, do they really know the way? Because, this is not like, there's no street maps, right? Obviously, there's no GPS. They didn't even have, for young people, they didn't even have that laminated book that all of us had in the back seat. Did you guys have that? Right? It's, okay, so back in the days, before you had GPS, you actually had to know how to read a map or you will get lost, right? And so there was a book that at least I thought every responsible parent did, right? When you got your license, it's a book you get at the gas station, at least that's where we got it. And it's laminated, it's big, it's probably about like 11 by 17, and it is a map of every town in your state. So like if you lived in Connecticut, you got the Connecticut book. And so that's how I knew, like, where are we? It's like, okay, look at the map. And it's actually, I actually think it's really cool. You like look at it, like, okay, and if you had somebody sitting next to you, then they are literally your GPS. They're like, okay, we're here. And I'm like, I just passed Main Street. And they're like, okay, Main Street, turn right now. And then we would get along that way. No, it's crazy. How did we not die? I actually don't know, because sometimes I wonder, back in the days, how did we like not kill ourselves driving with that, right? But this is the ocean we're talking about, right? And so they're like, yeah, we read the wind and the stars and the sun and that kind of stuff, and that's how we know our direction. But like, come on, the ocean has no landmarks, right? And if you're like a math nerd, right, and like with geometry, and you're off by like a one or two angles, but then you go like many miles. That distance you're off is huge, right? And it's not that many miles before you can't see you miss your island, and then you run out of supplies and you all die out there, right? And so it's like, this hope that they had of we know the way was in a situation with real danger, right? So it's real hope, but in real danger. And I think that speaks to all of us, just because we're human, right? That idea of like, we all want to be in a situation where we can be hopeful and brave, even though there is like real danger involved, right? We all wish we had that kind of courage and bravery, right? And I think the only way to have that is if we had hope. Because if you didn't have hope, right? If Moana's ancestors didn't have hope and they knew the dangers, they would not go. They would say, hey, this island's pretty good. And that's actually kind of like the part of the story, right? It's like, this is not going to work, right? But because they had that hope, they can face those dangers and still go. And we wish we all had that kind of courage and bravery as well. And that theme of inspirational hope is all over pop culture. It's not like Moana is the only story that's ever had this, right? It's everywhere. And a lot of times when we watch that movie or read that book that has it, we start to, like, there's something in us that gets stirred that's like, yeah, we're excited about it. And that's why those movies and stories get really popular. And this is actually the theme that's in Daniel chapters 8 to 12, which is what we're in. We're in part 8. It's the last couple of chapters, 8 to 12. But it's a little strange to think that hope is the theme, because chapters 8 to 12 has a lot of really strange visions, and some of them are kind of scary, and at first glance it doesn't seem very hopeful, but that actually is the whole theme here. Okay, and so we're going to take a look at how that fits, how hope fits in 8 to 12, and then what it means for us. And that's kind of how we're going to explore this last part. Okay? All right, so chapter 8, the ram and the goat. So in chapter 8, we're actually in the third year of Belshazzar, which is about 2 years after chapter 7. So from last year, and what happened there with Daniel, it's about 2 years later. And in verse 3 to 7, it says this: I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns. I watched the ram as it charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against it, and none could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became great. Suddenly, a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west. It came toward the 2-horned ram and charged at it in great rage. I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. Okay, so it's like, okay, that's something, right? And so the vision of the ram and the goat is really talking about Persia and Greece again, right? So the ram represents the Persian Empire, and Greece, the goat represents the Greek Empire. Right, and every time you see that horn, they talk about horns and smashing horns. Like the horn is just a symbol of power and kings, right? And so that's kind of why you see that imagery there. Okay, and then in verse 16, it says, "And I heard a man's voice from the Uli calling, 'Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision.'" Okay, and so this is actually the first time Gabriel is mentioned in the Bible. Gabriel is mentioned only 4 times. Once here, another time in chapter 9, and then twice in the New Testament. But it's about the same thing, right? And so, if you are, I guess, like a sci-fi. No, it's not sci-fi. I don't know. Like there are genres of like books and movies where they like use like characters that are from the Bible. Like Gabriel, like the angel Gabriel is something that you'll see in literature, right? And they kind of like create this whole, like, this is who Gabriel is. We don't really have no idea, right? It's only mentioned 4 times, and it's like, okay, is this some kind of angel or heavenly being? But this is actually the first time it's mentioned. So if you're like into literature and that kind of stuff, you're like, oh, where did Gabriel come from? Here it is, okay? And then, these visions that Daniel has are really taking a toll on him, right? In verse 27, it says, I, Daniel, was worn out. I lay exhausted for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. And so these visions that Daniel is having really take a toll on him, right? And I just say this to talk about how visions and dreams appear to be very different in the Bible. So when somebody in the Bible has a dream about something, it's like, okay, but when they have a vision, it appears that it's very different, right? How is it? I don't know, but like it clearly is, it really affects Daniel. So it's not just like, I had a nightmare, this is scary, but I mean, to be like worn out and exhausted for several days, like that vision is more than a dream, okay? So just understand that as you read scripture and you're seeing like visions versus dreams, okay? So that's chapter 8. Chapter 9 is Daniel's prayer. And so now we're in the first year of King Darius. And so that's about 14 years, maybe, depends on how you date King Darius's reign, about 14 years after chapter 8. Okay, so over time, these chapters are happening back to back, and we kind of think they're just like, and next week Daniel had this. No, this is, over a decade of time has passed. So this is like throughout his life, okay? This chapter is famous because of this 77s. Right, or the 70 weeks prophecy. All right, I'm going to read chapter 9, verse 24 to you. 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. And so this is a really famous, like a chapter, and I'm not going to talk about it, right? It's like this, and here's why. Right? You can really, like, people debate over what these 77s mean. They go all over the place, which is fine. If that's your thing, great, right? But I think in the theme of today's message, it's actually not that important. And so what I'll do is I'll actually include a little like article about this in Wednesday's newsletter. And so if you're like, but I want to know what the 77s means or what it could mean, I'll include that in the newsletter and you guys can go nuts with that, okay? But basically in chapter 9, Daniel is looking at Jeremiah's writings. And remember, Daniel and Jeremiah were contemporaries. They overlapped. Jeremiah's a little bit earlier, and then and Daniel's a little bit later. But there was a time when both of them were alive. Okay, and so Daniel is actually looking at what Jeremiah the prophet is saying and writing, and he realizes that the 70 years that Jeremiah prophesies that is almost up. And Daniel is in Daniel's prayer, Daniel is basically going to God and asking God, hey, God, the 70 years are almost up. Will you fulfill your promise? At least the promise that Daniel thinks that God is making, right? And in verse 18, it says, Give ear, our God, and hear. Open your eyes and see the desolation of the city that bears your name. That's Jerusalem. We do not make requests of you because we are righteous, but because of your great mercy. And that's where I want to focus on, because I think it's such a beautiful acknowledgement of God's mercy and sovereignty. So Daniel is going into this prayer, and he's not going into it like, God, please do X, Y, Z, because this is what I want, this is what I really need. It's because I've served you well, I've been faithful and all that kind of stuff, and so can you can you answer this prayer? He doesn't go into it that way, which is how I think we often do it. He goes into it just going, God, because of your mercy. It's not because of what I've done, my righteousness. It's just because of your mercy, and that's how he pleads with God. And I want to say that because I think it is very common for us today as believers to kind of have this like unspoken theology of, if you do your quiet times, if you pray consistently, if you go to church consistently, if you serve, and if you have all these things like that we call faithful Christian, right? Then when you pray, God is going to look at you and say, oh, well done. Okay, I think I'm going to answer that. Where if we don't, the likelihood of God answering our prayers gets lower. We won't ever say that, but I think it is very common for us to live out that kind of belief. And then all of a sudden, it turns all of our acts of devotion and worship into this really like not good transactional thing with God, right? And that was never meant to be the case. And I just want to show you that in Daniel. I love how he says this. It says, we do not make requests of you because we are righteous. Even though when you look at Daniel's life, like Daniel was a great guy. Like he was so faithful. And he says, we're making this request not because we're righteous, but because of your great mercy. And I just want to point that out in chapter 9 because I think that is so important for us to hear, okay? And so, but then afterwards, Gabriel comes again and basically says, it's not done yet. So, and that's like, oh, all right. All right, so that's chapter 9, okay? Chapter 10, this is where it gets real weird. The man in linen, okay? Linen is not that popular of a clothing material. I've had one linen shirt in my life because I was forced to buy it because I had a beach wedding I had to go to, and as one of the groomsmen, it's like we wore a linen shirt. It's kind of scratchy, right? But so a lot of times people don't like, what's linen? It's like a kind of material, right? But so if you're familiar with it, great. If you're not, it's a little bit scratchy, okay? But apparently it's really nice, okay? The man in linen. All right, this is actually the last vision for Daniel, and it spans chapters 10 to 12. Okay, so it's like a 3-chapter where we're talking about the same vision, okay? It's in the 3rd year of Cyrus, and if we go, remember we talked about how like Cyrus and Darius, like who are these guys? And it's like, it's very possible that Darius is just another name for Cyrus, right? And if we go with that idea, then this is about 2 years after chapter 9. Okay, and so if Cyrus is not Darius, and Darius is like a regional ruler for the emperor of Cyrus, then it's a little bit longer. So at least 2 years after chapter 9. Okay, and I just say all these numbers not because I like numbers, but I do. I like this kind of stuff. But I say it to really just emphasize that this is Daniel's life, right? Daniel started life in the court in Jerusalem, right? He was either a nobility or some kind of in the family of high officials. Like he was like upper echelon, right? And then Israel falls and he gets exiled and deported to Babylon in that first group, okay? And from there, he's worked his way up, and he's in the Babylonian and the Persian government and that kind of stuff. But throughout his life, man, over and over, he's getting these visions, and it is freaking him out, right? So this is like long-term stuff. This is like happening throughout Daniel's life. Like this is how he's characterized. Daniel, a guy who is faithful and gets all these visions that are really freaky. Okay, so that's why I share like all these numbers and years and that kind of stuff. Okay, but in chapter 10, there are 3 characters. Okay, the first one is the man in linen. And then in verse 5 to 6, I'll read, I looked up, and there before me was a man dressed in linen with a belt of fine gold. His body was like topaz, his face like lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and his voice was the sound of a multitude. We are not sure who this is. Some would be like, well, I mean, clearly this guy is amazing, so it's got to be Jesus, right? It's going to be... probably not. I'll go into why it's probably not Jesus a little bit later, but we don't know. Maybe it is, right? But I'm going to say probably not. Okay, so you have this man in linen that Daniel sees. And then the second character is Michael, verse 13. But the prince of the Persian kingdom resisted me meaning the man in linen, 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me because I was detained there with the king of Persia. So I know you have questions, but first, this is the first mention of Michael, right? So again, in literature, the angel Michael, right? A lot of times the archangel Michael, whatever, is in literature. So this is the Michael we're talking about here. And so we're assuming like he's some kind of angel or heavenly being. And he's only mentioned in Daniel and again a couple times in the New Testament. So again, these are not like characters like Gabriel and Michael that are really well fleshed out in the Bible. So like a lot of the stuff we see and hear about in like like pop culture stories, it's just people like really building on that on their own. Like in Scripture, we don't really see too much of that. And then the third character is this prince of the Persian kingdom, right? In verse 13 we just read, right? Very weird, right? Super weird. What is going on, right? He's clear. So this prince of the Persian kingdom is clearly not a human prince of the Persian kingdom. Right? So scholars are thinking, is this some kind of like spirit over the Persian kingdom? And this prince of the Persian kingdom can resist the man in linen for 21 days. And so this is why a lot of scholars think, I don't think the man in linen is Jesus. Because can any spirit resist Jesus for 21 days or at all? And then Jesus, and this man in linen needed Michael to come and help this battle thing. This is weird stuff, right? And so all to say is the man in linen is probably not Jesus, but what he is, who he is, we're really not sure, right? And so in chapter 10, it's just like the man in linen comes and speaks to Daniel, but he's late. And he's like, oh, I'm late because I was held up by the prince of the Persian kingdom, and I was for 3 weeks. And then Michael came. We double teamed that guy, and then we won, or at least shoot him away. And now I'm here. Here's the vision, right? Super weird, right? And on a side note, I'll try to do this fast. You may hear in some Christian circles they talk about some stuff like principalities, right? They'll be like, oh, like the principality of greed over this area, right? And so the idea is this, okay? Some Christians will say, they will look at like an area or a group of people or whatever, like we'll just take like San Francisco, right? Tech hub, right? Tons and tons of money. And they all think they're like the world's greatest people, they're going to solve all our world's problems with AI or kill us all, right? But they're like, yeah, it's about the same thing, right? And so there's tons of money there, tons of greed, and somebody might say, I'm just saying some people, I'm not saying this, right? They'll say, oh, there's a spirit of like greed and pride over San Francisco, right? They'll say there's the principality of darkness of greed and pride over there, right? I don't know if you've heard that, but like in some Christian circles, they kind of talk in that kind of language. They may say like LA because it's all about like, Hollywood and that kind of stuff. It's like vanity and that kind of stuff, right? And if you hear that, this is kind of where they're getting that from, right? They're like, oh, I think like, are there like these evil empires, the Persian Empire, Babylon, and then is there like a spiritual like demon that kind of helps them? Is that why they got so popular? A lot of this is speculation, right? And it kind of makes sense, right? But I'm just saying, like, that's where some of that is from. This prince of the Persian kingdom, we really don't know, like, how this all works. But that's where, if you hear that in your, like, in different conversations with other Christians, if they talk about that way, that's like a circle of Christians that, like, they kind of go with that route, right? Sure, right? That's fine, right? Because whether it's a literal spirit or just like, hey, you know what? We do notice that this area, like, they do more focus on, like, things like wealth and technology with leads to pride, all that kind of stuff, right? Or whether it's like Washington, D.C., it's like all corruption, it's like spirit of corruption, or is it just like, that's what happens when you get a bunch of politicians together, like, they get corrupt, right? Right. So that's where it's from, right? But here's the thing. As we're reading this and we're just trying to picture, like, what is going on? The question is, maybe this was not meant to be taken literally. After all, this is a vision, right? This is not like, Daniel is not here and just like, oh yeah, Daniel is seeing a vision here, which is not exactly like a dream, but also not just like, oh, look at this, and the whole point of this vision, right, and to kind of like what do I take away from it? The whole point of this vision is that there is a battle between God's kingdom and the forces of evil. That's basically what is being said, right? There is a battle between God's kingdom and the forces of evil, and it is intense, and in the end, God's kingdom wins, right? So that if you're like, this is too much for me to handle, give me a one-sentence thing. That's what it is, okay? All right, chapter 11, all right? Yeah, I know I'm running wrong. This is just a lot here, okay? Chapter 11, kings of the south and the north, right? The kings of the south and the north are likely, almost certainly, to be about the time after Alexander the Great dies and the Greek Empire is split, okay? So it's just super quick history lesson, okay? Alexander the Great has his massive kingdom. He dies, but he doesn't name a successor, and he doesn't have like an heir. And so what he does as he's dying is he basically, this is like, wow, this is actually very progressive of him, right? And instead of saying like, oh, it's going to go to he just says, hey, this should go to the strongest. Wow, that really opens up, right? And so all his generals are like, okay. And so what you have after Alexander, his kingdom is split. Some of the generals who are really powerful, like they kind of form their own thing. And you have the Seleucid Empire. That's the kings of the south. That's the kings of the north. They are based out of Syria. And then you have the Ptolemaic Empire, and that's the south, and that's based out of Egypt, right? And so that's most likely like what this is referring to. And this is the vision that Daniel is seeing that's going to happen in the future. But the detail, then scholars will like start throwing all these details, and it's like, no, this is exactly it, because look, like this, like they'll start like naming specific kings and that kind of stuff. None of it matches perfectly with history, and so some people are like, that's why there's like arguments over this stuff. But I think a lot of that debate is kind of silly because, again, Daniel is receiving a vision, right? This is not a history lecture, right? Daniel's not like pulling up with a notebook, and Michael is like, or the man in linen is like, welcome to Future History 101. Like these are my PowerPoint slides. I will mail them out to you or email them out to you. But this is not what's happened. This is a vision. So I don't think it's gonna. It doesn't have to like match up everywhere. But this is kind of what's going on in chapter 11. Okay. All right. Let's finish up. Chapter 12. Right, the end times. Right. This is what we read in our scripture reading today. And again, very, very. Just like scary, right? Like what is going on here? Okay, the question we want to ask ourselves is this about past events or is this prophecy about the future? When I say is this about past events, I mean the kingdoms that were shown in, remember the vision of the statue and then the four beasts, right, of Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. Is it talking about the end times with like the past events, or is it in the future like with us, okay? In verse 1 to 3, it says, "At that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. There will be a time of distress such as has not happened from the beginning of nations until then. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever." Right? Again, Michael is mentioned here, and here there's a reference to bodily resurrection. Right? Which is just a side note, right? That is not an idea that is like really well established yet. Even in Jesus' time, it's like they're starting to understand it, but not everyone believes it. And then Paul in the New Testament, he actually uses that to his advantage, because he gets arrested, and both the Sadducees and the Pharisees just want to go after Paul, and Paul knows this is a sticking point. So Paul's like, "I'm not here because I preach about Jesus. I'm simply here because I believe in bodily resurrection." And then all the Pharisees like have to turn. This is like culture wars back then, right? "Oh yeah, there absolutely is, bodily resurrection. Yeah, Paul's great. Let him go." The Sadducees are like, "No, like you can't say that. There's no such thing as bodily resurrection." And then the Pharisees and the Sadducees had to fight over each other. And Paul, it almost reads like Paul is just like, "And that's my ticket to leave," right? And basically that's what happened. So we have here in Daniel, like this is an idea that's presented in the Word of God, and yet it's actually not that fleshed out yet at the time, right? And then it's not later until we kind of really understand it with Jesus, okay? And so is this about the past, or is it about the future? I think what we want to consider is maybe it's both, right? All these visions are strange and a bit scary. But they're actually about hope. The thing that's pointing to is hope, right? Hope for Daniel. Remember, think about Daniel's all his experiences in life of being in captivity and having all these visions over decades, right? Hope for Daniel in his time, and hope for us now. All these bad things happening, right, in Daniel's time, and all the crazy stuff happening now, right? There is hope. God wins. And all of it points to Jesus, okay? And so for us today, I think that is like the theme, right? But we want to talk about quickly and about how there are two kinds of hope, okay? There is temporal hope and biblical hope. Temporal hope is the word hope that we normally use. Like, I hope Gene will be done soon with this message, right? Or I hope the 49ers this year will win the Super Bowl. That's my temporal hope, right? And then there's a biblical hope, which is confident expectation of receiving what God promises. And so they're a little bit similar, but they're different in its basis. Right? And this is actually this is similar to how faith works, and this connects to faith, right? In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, it says this: "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see." And the key words are what we do not see. Right? Like faith requires that we have that confidence. It's something that it's not quite in front of us, not there. Right? Hope is the same thing, right? We have hope even though we can't see the outcome yet. And so there's a saying among several scholars, and they use the various forms, but basically it's this: faith is only as strong as its object. Meaning that your faith, the strength of your faith, is not about like your feelings and how strongly you feel that faith, but it really depends on the object of faith, right? And so an example is if you were to cross a rickety bridge, right? If you're like hiking and there's like this big chasm with water underneath and you have this rope bridge and you're like, is it safe to cross? Having that belief that that bridge is safe and will hold up is irrelevant to whether you cross it and live or fall to your death, right? It's all depends on that bridge and the structural integrity of it. And so our faith is not dependent on whether you believe or you have this whether you're like, oh, I know God's going to do this for me, or whether you're like, I don't have enough faith, right? It actually just depends on God and who God is, right? And so faith and hope are similar that way, where it's not about our feelings toward God. It's about who God is. And this is the question Daniel is wrestling with throughout his life, right? God says these things, and it doesn't really matter if Daniel feels hopeful. It really just matters who God is, and Daniel is wrestling with that, right? And so he has these visions where he's seeing, these like incredible things, and he's like, man in linen, okay. How does that tell me about who God is? And all the different visions. Like, that's what he's wrestling with. Like, obviously, he's like, what do these mean? And he's scared about that. But he's really asking the question, we need to ask that question ourselves, is who is God? Is God able? Right? Is God willing? And does God love me? Like, that's when you're thinking about your hope in life, and you're putting your faith and your hope in God, that's the questions you need to ask: is who is God? Like, is God the creator of the universe, the one that is beyond time and without limits and infinite and omniscient, omnipotent? Right? Who is God? Is he able? Does God have the power and strength to do or heal you or whatever? Is he willing, and does he love me? Like, those are the questions we have to ask ourselves, and these are the questions that really are at the core of our hope in God. Okay, and so before I pray, I just want to say one final thing. Right? We hear that and we're like, okay, like that's what I need to do. Is I need to kind of like examine my understanding of God and wrestle with that. Like, is God real? Is God powerful? Is God willing? Does God love me? Right? To wrestle with that. But here's the thing. Western Christians, we often focus on individual faith and hope, right? So you're sitting there going like, okay, that's my faith, my hope, right? But all this stuff that's happening with Daniel, all these visions he's seeing, is not about Daniel the individual. Right? Yeah, he has to think about individual, but they're not about Daniel the individual. These are huge, global, kingdom-wide things that God is showing him, right? He's showing him, like, basically all the major powers of history in this time period, and how, like, God is the one ultimately in control, right? So this is, like, way bigger than the individual, right? And so I think as Christians, we need to remember this, right? These visions are about nations, empire. It's about justice being done, right? And so what we need to remember as well is this: God does care about justice for everyone, right? God cares about how you live and how your faith and hope, where it resides. But he also cares about how the church as the broader church, how we operate justly. He does care about the big picture, right? And so if God cares about that, we should care as well, right? How that plays out in our lives could look very different, but we definitely do not want to be Christians who are like, I'm just going to focus on my life, stay in my lane, and you know what? All the stuff that's happening in the world, I'm not going to think about it, right? Because God cares about that stuff. All these visions are about that. And so we should care as well, right? And so God's great hope isn't just for you. It is for you, right? But it's also about the church collectively as well. So let's pray.